Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. And as always, I hope that you enjoy The Dirtlings, written by Destroymatron Mark 8. Rocks. Acting Primarch Rond quirked an ear as he sipped his clef. Rocks, Ambassador Vlen confirmed. You can't be serious. Rond watched as the alien fleet drifted over to join his forces on the view screen. The chamber of the Primarch had mostly been abandoned. Rond refused to run away. If this world was to end, then Rond would be ended with it. He would die as he had loved, on his feet and with a cup of clef in his hand. I'm quite serious, Rend assured him. They throw rocks. The acting Primarch squinted three of his eyes as he examined the fleet. Primitive designs. The human ships were barely capable of FTL, but they still used chemical propulsion to move within the system. They lacked the telltale shimmer of shielding systems, and Ron strongly suspected that they had nothing resembling inertial dampeners or artificial gravity. Why would you even ask for such a primitive species' help? We asked everyone for help, said Vlen. The humans were the only ones who said yes. The more foolish they, Ron mused. The Kulgan had warned the other species not to interfere. They had declared that any who aided the Bronze people would be destroyed alongside them. The Kulgan had given a similar warning when they invaded the Esserv. Ron sincerely wished his predecessor had heeded it. What do they hope to get out of this? They are a relatively new species. Bren sipped at his clef. Only achieved FTL within the last decade. They are very eager for an exchange of technologies. Of course they are, Ron snorted. Their idea of planetary defense is throwing rocks at people. As I said, they are fairly new, Blen pointed out, and their home system is devoid of any materials that we use to power most of our technologies. Basic elements only. Rond shifted two of his feet as he glared at the view screen. The Kulgan had arrived. I suppose that explains why such a primitive species hasn't been snapped up yet. He took another sip of his clef. They have nothing worth taking. Rond was beginning to see why the humans were willing to risk destruction. They desperately needed better materials. Worse, they were alone. Without strong allies and a significant upgrade in technology, they would be easy prey for whatever species bothered to snatch them up. The Fuelen Primarchy was one of the most advanced and powerful species in the galaxy, and they were everything the humans could hope for. Or at least, they had been, before Ron's predecessor pissed off the Kulgan. The previous Primarch had killed himself once he realized the gravity of his mistake, and good riddance. The galaxy was a harsh place, and soft-hearted fools had no business being in charge. Still, a part of Rond wished the cowardly fool hadn't done it. If Rond hadn't had to take his place, he could be sipping clef in some faraway ship, instead of waiting in his office to die. It's not as bad as all of that, said Vlen. They may be lacking materials, but the Dirtlings have made fine use of what they have. The acting Primarch quirked a dubious ear at his old friend. Dirtlings? Ambassador Vlen ran a hand over his ears. Their home planet, they named it Dirt. For a brief moment, Ron seriously considered strangling his oldest friend. They named their home world Dirt. Disdain dripping from his voice. And they plan to assault the most powerful military force in the galactic history by throwing rocks at it. A powerful need to shout seized the acting Primarch. He resisted, sipping his clef until he could regain his composure. He continued, Why did you even bring these people? No one else would come. Ron simmered silently as he watched the Kulgan approach. The Kulgan had always been powerful, but the Fuelen Primarchy had considered themselves their equals until a few years ago. The Kulgan had changed that with the unveiling of their dread ships. The dread ship was massive, nearly 7 times larger than Ron's homeworld. Such was its power that the millions of Kilgarn warships housed within were basically superfluous. Ron didn't know how long it had taken Kilgarn to construct the thing. Decades, at least. He did know that the combined might of the entire Fwelin Armada would barely be worth its notice. Not that he had the entire Fwelin Armada. Only a few million ships, a third of the force that he had left, had been stationed at their homeworld. The rest were guarding his people. Every ship in the Fwelin could scrape together had been stuffed with as many of his people as they could hold. Rond would die if he must. The Primarch would die if it must. But people must live on. Blen could sense his despondence. I know how it sounds. The Dirtlings don't seem like much, but they are very good at throwing rocks. He saw Ron's expression and quickly continued, They have been doing it for their entire history. Ron didn't even bother to respond, choosing instead to have another cup of clef. Vlen kept talking. At first they used rocks to ward off predators. They learned to use sharp rocks to hunt. They learned to use plant matter and sinew to throw rocks further. And they used rocks to fight each other, and started wearing rocks to protect them from other rocks. Ron remained silent, sipping his clef. As the technology grew, they threw rocks harder and faster. Blen waved 3 of his hands around as he spoke, warming up to the subject. They started making better rocks to throw, steel rocks, incendiary rocks, rocks that explode. When they achieved spaceflight, they found ways to throw rocks in a vacuum. Irritation poked its way through the acting Primarch's stoic silence. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand, the ambassador said. The Dirtlings love their rocks. They have a very special relationship. And they are quite good at throwing them. How nice for them. Ron glared back at the view screen. By the by, shouldn't there be more of them? I only see a few hundred Dirtlings approaching the dreadship. There are more, said the ambassador. That is just an expeditionary force. Most of the Dirtlings are in the asteroid belt. Ron quirked an ear. What for? Their leader said something about... Blen trailed off and seemed to wilt as little as he continued. Expanding the rock collection? Ron bobbled a sigh. Of course he did. The dreadship reached the Fwelin Armada a minute later. The defenders fired up an opening salvo, unleashing a full might of the Primarchy in a torrent of plasma and antimatter. Well, the third of what he had left did, anyway. The dreadship seemed not to notice, continuing its slow, steady approach. Ron had seen this play out dozens of times. He had hoped his generals would be able to come up with a better strategy, but in his heart he knew that it was not to be. Plasma slowed as it reached for the dreadship. Streams of antimatter reversed their course, and the Kilgarn had built the dreadship out of the densest materials that they could find. Its gravity was an order of magnitude greater than his home world's. That gravity had been reversed. Plasma was just superheated matter, and it lacked the kinetic force necessary to overcome such a strong gravitational push. Antimatter was affected in much the same way. The Armada was forced to maneuver as their weapons were repelled back towards them. His ships would need to get much closer before they could so much as singe the dreadnought's shields. Pure energy weapons were unaffected, but lasers and other pure energy weapons would be useless until the shields were brought down. If they even could be. The dreadship waited for them. The moment the first of the Ron's fleet struggled through the gravity and struck the giant ship's shields, it fired back millions upon millions of weapons discharged, shredding the Armada. Those few ships that survived turned back, having barely scratched the shields of the Kilgarn monstrosity. The Dirtling fleet had not moved with the Armada. They were still intact. They were throwing rocks. The Dirtlings don't need to get closer, Blen told him. Their rocks move quickly enough to overcome the gravity. Indeed, Ron sipped his clef. They don't seem to be doing much, though. Stopping fast-moving objects was the most basic function of a shield. Ron doubted a normal warship would be bothered much by dirtling rocks, and the dreadship would be thousands of times more protected. For its part, the Kilgon vessel took notice enough to send a few million lances of plasma at the humans. The humans had sufficient distance to move out of the way. A few seconds later, their ships began to melt and explode. Apparently, they had no protection against direct energy attacks. A few million lasers made short work of them. So much for the Dirtlings. Ron shook his head. He walked over to his desk and lifted the glass over the console that he'd installed. On the console was a button that would trigger a device. The device would trigger a chain reaction that would cause the sun to go nova. Ron hoped the nova would happen fast enough to catch the Kilgon and destroy the dreadship. But deep in his heart, he doubted that it would. "Mate, old friend." Glenn placed a hand on Ron's before he could press the button. Normally, such an impropriety would incense the acting Primarch, but Glenn was his oldest friend, and it was the end of the world. He withdrew his hand and regarded the ambassador. Ears tilted in question. "Now it's just an expeditionary force," the ambassador explained. "The real attack starts now." He pointed at the view screen. Movement. Very fast from the asteroid belts. The dreadship was at the edge of the solar system. For the objects to approach so quickly, they must be moving at a fraction of the speed of light. A large fraction. Maybe as high as 10%. Ron squinted at the screen, trying to make out the shape of the objects. They were rocks. Some of the rocks were only a few kilometers around, several of them outsized his planet's moons, and a wild hope pulled the acting Primarch away from his console. He ambled closer to the view screen. "I said it before," Ren said over the clef. "The Dirtlings are good at throwing rocks." The dreadship's reverse gravity could do little to soften the impact of an asteroid moving at such speeds. The first rock smashed against its shields, shattering fragments in all directions. Ron doubted a standard warship would have survived such a blow. More rocks struck at a fraction of a second later. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. For the first time, the Kilgon dreadship might be in danger. The dreadship began to move, a sphere of larger than a world could not maneuver the way a normal ship could, but the Dirtlings were throwing from far away. The Kilgon would have to weather some hits, but once they were moving, Ron was sure that they could avoid the worst of it. The dreadship moved out of the way of the rocks. The rocks moved back into the way of the dreadship. "How are they doing that?" Ron wondered aloud. "I told you," said Glenn. "The Dirtlings have a special relationship." The answer, Ron realized, was so simple, he'd almost chuckled. The Dirtlings had attached engines to the rocks, powerful engines, no doubt, operated by remote control. The rocks continued to smash against the Dreadnought shields. The dreadship began to launch its fleets. Ron's heart sank. Even if the Dirtlings succeeded in destroying the dreadship, the Kilgon fleet would be the end of them all. If Ron had the entirety of his armada still intact, he might have been able to make a fight of it, but his few remaining ships would easily be overwhelmed, and the human ships were basically helpless. A rock the size of a moon punched through the dreadship's shield. It plowed into a massive sphere. Such was the force of the impact that the entire dreadship rocked back. A hole the size of a continent bored through its frame. The shields flicked out. The Kilgon fleet ceased its deployment. Several of the ships fell back down to the surface of the Kilgon sphere. It took a moment for Ron to realize what had happened. He stared in wonder as more rocks crashed into and through the dreadnought. The impact of the giant rock had caused a plow fluctuation. The Kilgon had lost gravity control. Without it, the natural gravity of so much dense material had turned every Kilgon on board into a puddle. Ron was willing to wager most of the warships hadn't been ready for a sudden shift, and their crews had been turned into smears as well. Only a few dozen ships managed to escape the dreadship, and several of those were dashed into pieces amidst the storm of the Dirtlings' rocks. Ron went back to his console and opened up the communications link with the remains of the armada. Attention, this is the Primarch. Jam all further communications and engage the remaining Kilgarn. No survivors. He ended the transmission. Rond was reasonably sure the Kilgarn hadn't yet reported on the dread ship's demise. He'd like to keep how it was done a secret, if he could. The remainder of the Fwellen Armada moved in. There were only a few hundred of them left, but that was more than enough to deal with a few dozen Kilgarn warships. The Dirtlings had stopped launching asteroids almost immediately after the destruction of the dread ship, but it was another 40 minutes before the last rock hit the thing. By that time, the remaining Kilgarns had been destroyed, and the Armada had stopped jamming communications. "What is the name of the lead Dirtling?" Rond asked Blen. "Admiral Wells," Blen answered. The acting Primarch hailed the leader of the Dirtlings. "Admiral Wells, this is acting Primarch Ron Valvaloy. My compliments. Together we have won a great victory." Her face appeared on the view screen, a symmetrical oval head. Only 2 eyes, pale, devoid of fur except for the mane on the top. Rond had met many species. Few were uglier than this, but none had filled Rond with greater joy. He wondered if the Dirtling drank Clef. Perhaps he would invite her to share a cup. Acting Primarch Rond, the Dirtling could not bow the Fwellen way, but she offered the closest gesture that she could approximate. Her voice was far too high and musical to speak Rond's language, but the console's translator conveyed meaning well enough. "Indeed we have. May it be a start of a beautiful friendship." "I am sure that it will," Rond replied. He sipped his Clef. "The ambassador told me you and Rox have a special relationship." The Admiral's face scrunched up. The translator told Rond it meant the Dirtling was confused. "Give me excuse? I don't understand." The Dirtling were a new species. Maybe the translator hadn't worked out the kinks yet. Ron tried again. "I heard that you were good at throwing rocks." "Oh!" The Admiral's face unscrunched. "Yes!" She bared her teeth in an aggressive display. "If throwing rocks doesn't solve your problem, you just need to throw bigger rocks." The translator informed Rond that the aggressive display meant that she was pleased. "That's how we do things on planet Dirt." End of story. The algorithm reckons you should be watching this video next, and I recommend that you should be always watching my video. So, click with energy! And yes, clicking that does help the channel. Thank you very much. I'd just like to give a quick thanks to the T5 channel members and patrons: Alithia, Parky, Fudic Yol, Meridian117, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Angry Marine, Lord Azrakal, and White Van 420.